This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers, on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio brings you relevant and detailed discussions of software engineering topics at least once a month. SE Radio is brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine, online at computer.org/software.
This is Johannes for SE Radio. We have another episode with Rachel Laycock and Max Lincoln, and I will start with reading the biographies. Rachel Laycock is a market principal for ThoughtWorks New York. She works mainly as a technical lead and architect. Her work is to help clients to introduce continuous delivery in the software workflow. She is editor-in-chief of the P3 magazine, a monthly online magazine about technical excellence. She is also a member of the ThoughtWorks Technical Advisory Boards, which meets regularly to produce the ThoughtWorks Technical Radar. Welcome to the show, Rachel.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Max Lincoln is a continuous delivery lead consultant for ThoughtWorks New York. He passionately promotes the use of continuous delivery and DevOps to achieve technical success. He is a frequent contributor to open source cloud, quality assurance, and documentation projects, such as the Windows support for Travis CI and the Vagrant plugin for Rackspace. Welcome to the show, Max.
Thank you.
Why don't we start with Rachel? Is there anything you want to add to your biography?
Only that it's a P2 magazine, not P3. Oh. Sorry.
All right. Max?
Just that the Windows stuff for Travis CI, it's still a work in progress, but hopefully we'll make some good progress, and I'm hoping there'll be Windows support in the future.
So let's start with a very basic question. What is continuous delivery on Windows? Or what is continuous delivery and why do you need it to do on Windows?
Wow, I'm going to answer that in one question. Continuous delivery is about putting the ability to release back in the hands of the business by making your software, putting your software into a state that it's always releasable. And there's a lot of practice in order to make something like always deployable, always ready for release, and that includes everything from automating the quality assurance, the way that you architect your system in small enough pieces to be able to deliver, in terms of how you manage your releases, in terms of continuous integration and constant check-ins that have tests against them and compile, and this is happening every day, all day, regular check-ins. In terms of automating your deployments and then automating the standing up of your infrastructure. And so and also in terms of like how you structure your organization to be able to release rapidly and have that flexibility within the processes that you have. So there's a lot to continuous delivery, and it builds on top of a lot of other practices like automation in terms of QA and automation of infrastructure and automation of deployments, and it builds on a lot of other things. So it's quite a broad scope. That's why I laugh when I say what is continuous delivery, because it's a lot. And I think a lot of people think it's what's the word? It's the same as DevOps, but it's not. There's a lot more to it. And then what is it on Windows? It's the reason we call out Windows specifically is just because a lot of that automation is just a little bit harder on Windows, and it doesn't have the same level of support that you get on Linux environments.
For me, the difference between continuous delivery and continuous integration is with continuous integration you just have usually a build that sort of is all of your tests for the project. And when you look at it, it's a process and it's automation, but there's a big cultural piece that goes along with both. So when organizations start doing CI, a lot of times the main question on everyone's mind is the build green? Let's keep the build green, all of that stuff. I think continuous delivery, even though you still have pipelines you're trying to keep green, it changes it because the end goal is really deploying, and it's not just keeping the software tested and keeping that green. It's the entire flow from the testing in different phases, so you can get feedback in phases, but the security, performance testing, sign-offs from the business, whatever has to happen. So I think for teams doing CI, the question in their mind a lot of time is the build still green? And for continuous delivery teams, I think a lot of times it's how long has it been since we released?
And it changes your perspective of especially in a development team, of what you're building. It's no more longer just about development. It's like, how does it run in production in terms of like performance and load and all that. You start having to really care about these concerns because you're releasing all the time.
Actually, I remember when I joined ThoughtWorks, because you talked a lot about continuous integration. There was this continuous delivery talk on. Can you elaborate on what continuous integration actually means and where continuous delivery goes beyond it?
Well, for me, one interesting thing is a lot of the stuff I've been working on recently is more libraries instead of applications. And so when I'm building just a tool or a library, CI is still most of the time all I sort of really need.
But what is CI actually?
I can answer that if you like.
Sure.
So CI is it's continuous integration. It's the practice of continually integrating. So some of the practices involved in CI are things like trunk-based development. So don't have like an everlasting feature branch that's going to cause you an incredible amount of pain when you're merging. It's about the developers checking in all the time, and that whole build green thing is what makes the build green, right? It's that all the unit tests pass, all the integration tests pass, all the functional level tests pass on every check-in, and you guys are checking in regularly, and you have a pipeline of tests that give you the confidence that your check-in isn't breaking anything, because it's all about fast feedback. So it's continually integrate to get fast feedback on your changes.
Yeah, I think the big goal with continuous delivery is to not get stuck in the last mile before releasing. And I think continuous integration tries to take care of making sure there's no merge hell where you've got different teams doing different things and they try and bring the code together at the last minute and they find conflicting changes.
Yeah.
But I think with continuous delivery, you still have that part of it. You're doing the CI to try and avoid merge hell, but you're bringing in other things like security and usability testing or whatever into the mix.
I think it builds on top of. So when people... I often get upset when people think continuous delivery is just DevOps, because you actually need the practice of CI in order to be able to you need to be mature enough in terms of, are you doing CI in order to be able to do continuous delivery?
Maybe so that we have it clear, what do you mean by DevOps, so that people know what continuous delivery is not just.
Oh, okay. So the way I think about continuous delivery to start with is, in my head, I think of it as a pipeline. So I think about the first things you need to think about is your architecture and the way that your organization is structured. Then it's about quality assurance. So all the things that you currently do to make sure your software is of high quality, automate the hell out of that. And then it's about continuous integration. So is everyone checking in all the time? Are we not merging? Are we using trunk-based development? Are we using other patterns in order to do big changes like branch by abstraction or feature toggles or whatever it may be? And then you get onto that, you've got the data issue, like how are you going to release data continuously? And then, not data itself, but like how are you going to release schema changes? And then the last part is the deployment and the infrastructure automation. And I think DevOps sits in that last part of deployment and infrastructure automation, but the DevOps is actually about a cultural change of dev and ops not throwing stuff over the wall, right? So no longer do developers get to say, I'm done because I finished developing. I'm now going to throw this over to the ops guy and see you later. Have fun deploying over the weekend. It's now we're automating that, and those guys work together. It's a cultural change. So they work together to automate, put this into production, stand up the environments. They know what each other's doing. There's no over the wall. They're all responsible for, the developers are also responsible for what goes into production. And so for me, DevOps is just one part of continuous delivery.
Yeah, for me, DevOps is the cultural piece, and it's usually a necessary part of continuous delivery. You really can't achieve what you want with continuous delivery without having some DevOps mindset. I don't think it's necessarily true the other way around. Like, one thing that I think fits within the DevOps space, but isn't necessarily part of continuous delivery, is ChatOps. like GitHub talked about, they have bots that their ops guys use where when they need to, all of their administration they basically do through a chat channel, which is really cool in terms of letting especially like more junior people or the developer team know what's happening, because as they're releasing to production or doing whatever, it's in the chat channel so people can see it and they can talk about it, but there's actually bots in the channel that are responding to their commands and deploying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when I summarize it, so we have the developers doing code, doing maybe data, checking in, then there is a continuous integration happening, which is making software, runnable software out of this, running all the tests, making sure it's correct. And then we move into the DevOps space, kind of, in that when the software is done, we continuously make it ready to be in production by providing servers, configuring servers, and packaging it up.
Well, I don't think the DevOps sort of comes later in the process. I think it's throughout the whole process. So it's something that should be happening even when the developer is writing the code. An example of just people not having the right mindset and developers and operations not talking to each other. I was working on an application where they needed geolocation of the home page. And so the developers just took the requirement from the business and they went to implement it without talking to a lot of ops people and thinking it through a lot. And so they implemented geolocation in Rails for the homepage. But the problem was it was not really that performant. And so then later we had to make the homepage cacheable. So basically, even though the feature was done, it was effectively unusable because it was hidden behind cache. So I think if developer and ops were talking earlier, they would have said, you really should be implementing this in something like Varnish up front, because that makes much more sense from a operations perspective.
Yeah, I would agree with that, actually. So the reason I say that I think about it in terms of a pipeline and I said DevOps at the end is like these are the practices that have built on top of each other. So we started automating a lot of the QA stuff. We started doing continuous integration. That's more automation. And the work that started happening in DevOps in terms of these guys working together and using the same tools is what built on top of that. But you do need to be thinking about all of those things right at the start of your project. Like not just how am I going to develop this, but how is it going to run in production, which is exactly the point that you had.
All right. So if I'm now convinced by your arguments that I want to do continuous delivery and I am on Windows, what decisions do I need to take to make this happen?
So when I gave a talk last year, the way that I broke this up, and this I also broke it up in my head, was thinking about it in terms of like build, deploy, and then infrastructure automation. And the build part is the easiest part in Windows because there's so many tools that are already out there. It was the deploy and the automation of infrastructure that got really painful.
So can you shortly mention what was easy? So what do you use for build, and maybe give us a short overview. How do I use it?
Yeah. So, do you want to talk to this?
No, go
it's
ahead.
Okay. So with the build stuff, I mean, you can use things like MS Build and in terms of the TI tools out there, there's things like TeamCity, there's Go. You can even use Jenkins. All of those things will kick off PowerShell scripts or whatever you want. There's things like Sake, which I've started to play with last year, which is a much nicer than an XML-based language. And then there's nice things in terms of the actual source control management. So you can use Git. I've been using Git on Windows for the longest time, and whenever I have to go back to TFS, it hurts. But yeah.
Why does it hurt?
It has some nuances. The first one is the fact that it will do these server-side merges, or at least it did last time I was playing with it. Maybe they've made it better since, but this if two people check in at the same time, then it will merge it for you on the server, which doesn't give you that confidence that my build the thing I just tested on my machine is actually the same as what's going to get built on the server on the build server, which is a bit scary. It's also quite slow. It's also people TFS is trying to solve too many problems. So it's also trying to be a CI server as well, and it's very XML based.
TFS does everything around that. When I get it right?
Yeah, it does. It tries to do too much. I like tools that do one thing really, really well and work well with other tools. That's my preference, and and TFS is not the friendliest when it comes to that.
So I guess that's sort of Unix philosophy is do one thing and do it well. And
right.
The Windows philosophy, I don't know as much about TFS, but your description of it reminds me of SharePoint, which is trying to be everything.
Yeah, again, it's like just do one thing and do it well. Don't stop trying to do everything. And so I was at a client last year, and the team was just starting to use TFS. And they were doing this big presentation and all the things that it can do and the builds and the way that you can hook it up to your stories, and it can manage your stories for you, agile stories. And I'm like, but there are so many other tools that can manage stories better for you. There's better source control management tools, and there's way better build tools. So why don't you just pick one and be really good at it instead of being really not so great at all of them? And generally, like in terms of a build tool, I've seen a build that was written in team build that took 20 minutes, and I've seen it go down to like 3 in another tool just because of how like cumbersome the build tool is inside of TFS, or team build as it's called.
So we talked about build. What is deploy?
So I mean, one thing that has improved in the Windows space before you deploy is to be able to package things up, right? So I mean, I have an example right now where I'm on a client where they literally have like 5 solutions in one solution, and so every time you want to make one change, like you have to build the thing, it takes like 7 minutes. That's just locally on your machine. Every time I want to compile, it takes 7 minutes. This is ridiculous. And so with things like NuGet, which is an undopen wrap is another one like NuGet, we now have packages, which is like, yay, packages for the win. So now we can, like, things that hardly ever change, we can package them off and consume them, and then you can package things up for deploy, and you can package all the third-party libraries. In terms of deploy, so again, there is MS deploy, but I've found that 9 times out of 10 you're just going to end up writing stuff in PowerShell, and so that's really, as soon as you start moving into that space, it's time to like learn PowerShell.
Mm-hmm. The stuff going on in the infrastructure automation and deployment space for Windows seems to be getting interesting, because not that long ago it seemed like there was nothing. And now Microsoft's really starting to invest in some of the projects that were out there. So with NuGet, Microsoft recently in their, what's the PowerShell API called? Something framework.
Oh, yeah. What, WinRM are you talking about? Are you talking
Yeah, but it's the whatever package WinRM is part of.
Oh, man.
So, yeah, in the deployment and infrastructure automation space, things are starting to get interesting. So NuGet's been around for a while, and it's been fairly successful, and recently Microsoft announced OneGet, which is a tool they're building into Windows that's basically going to be Windows having an official package manager, which is a gigantic change for Windows.
Wow.
And when it launches, in the future it might support other stuff, but it's going to pull from Chocolatey. It'll have the Chocolatey integration. So I think in a lot of ways it's sort of Microsoft officially endorsing Chocolatey.
What is Chocolatey? Is it can I think of it like apt-get, or what is it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's how they always describe it. It's very inspired by apt-get, and it's supposed to be apt-get for Windows. So it's powered by NuGet and PowerShell, and it's essentially a package manager and silent installer for Windows. So if you want to install, like setting up the stuff for Travis CI, they need on each of their boxes to have Git, Mercurial, and Subversion. And those packages actually worked really well, both in Chef and PowerShell. So I just had to say in a declarative way, I want Git on the box. And Chef knew to tell Chocolatey, I need Git, and then Chocolatey decides, okay, do you need a 32 or 64-bit installer, and then how am I going to run it with all of the right flags so that it just installs silently. There's also Microsoft is doing the desired state configuration, which is PowerShell stuff, which is declarative and looks really interesting. When I first saw it, I sort of thought it looked like a competitor to Puppet Chef and Danceable. And I was like, I don't know if we really need more fragmentation. But they actually, when they demoed it along with Chef, and it looks really cool because it's declarative language for saying what you want the server or servers to be, but it's integrated right into the operating system and sort of the Windows Server management stuff. And so rather than a competing product, they're sort of providing the lower level layer that Puppet, Chef, and Danceable can call in order to more easily manage Windows servers.
Yeah, because that's what's been missing for the longest time.
Yeah.
So NuGet, was like an open source tool. The stuff so Chocolatey again was like an open source community tool. So I mean, years ago when I was running a user group in London alongside a few others, the big part of that community, because it was a .NET user group, was the AltNet community. And I don't even know if that's still going, but what came out of that community was things like NuGet, OpenWrap. People started building the tools that they could see were missing, right? Especially if you go into a Linux environment, you're like, oh, we don't have a tool for that. That's not fair. I want one. People start creating these tools, and what I'm seeing is like Microsoft then consumes them, which is good, right? As long as they consume them and don't make them evil and turn them into TFS.
Yeah. I'm really interested in what Microsoft's doing, but I feel like on Linux, we're basically at a state where we're doing incremental improvements, and we've got a lot of the tools to do all of the automation and continuous delivery stuff that we want. It seems like on the Microsoft side, they're doing more of a revolutionary transformation, and Windows starting to do some of this desired state configuration, Windows Server Core, which is more scaled down Windows, PowerShell, OneGet, all of those things. So I'm hopeful, but I'm a little concerned because it's revolutionary and because it's still somewhat early, I'm not sure how long it'll be before things on Windows start getting as easy as they're sort of promising they should be.
Yeah. Do we want to go a little bit deeper into this usage of Ansible and Chef and Puppet on Windows? So what you're talking about sounds very promising. Maybe highlight a little bit why it is so promising. What is making you hope for the future with these tools, and maybe elaborate a little bit on how you use those tools.
Well, one of the things that I'm not sure I like about PowerShell and desired state configuration is that it seems like there's a operations scripting language, and then there's general purpose development languages. One of the nice things from, that DevOps culture perspective that's happened is that a lot of the operations tools on the Linux side have started to use more general purpose languages, and it makes it easier for the developers and the operations guys to pair and go back and forth. So you've got, the build and deployment tools, they might be in Ruby and you're building a Ruby application, or there's Ansible, interesting stuff with Python. So the PowerShell desired state configuration stuff looks interesting. PowerShell's got a lot of interesting features, but with things like Chef, when people were first starting to do it, they would include a lot of bash scripting inside the Chef stuff because they were still figuring it out. But then they decided that was an anti-pattern. You should be trying to do as much just Chef DSL or Ruby stuff. It made it more readable, and it made it easier to collaborate both with developers, and I guess in this case it'll make it easier for people with Windows backgrounds and Linux backgrounds to sort of start collaborating a bit more.
Yeah, maybe let's take one step back and make clear to the people who have never heard of Chef, what is it used for? So why do I need Chef?
So Puppet, Chef, and Ansible, they're all essentially tools for infrastructure automation and infrastructure as code. And so it allows you to take the all of the operations things you're doing, and first of all, automate it so that instead of like this 10-page installation and configuration guide for the application and a checklist or run book that people have to go through to do everything, that you have that all automated in a script. And also, it's become much more like normal code in the sense that we can use version controls for this stuff. And there's different ways of setting it up, but I generally like it when the infrastructure code and the application code are co-located, so they're sort of versioned and released together. And you can also do a lot more with testing more easily with this stuff. There's great tools like Test Kitchen and Server Spec and Food Critic and all kinds of things for Chef or similar tools.
And I think the great thing about them is the desired state part. So rather than it just being a shell script that's going, go and make these changes on the server, it's like it's telling the server what it should look like. And I really like that about them.
So you tell the server, I want you to have an IIS running on port 80.
Yeah, exactly. And a big part of the problem that's been in Windows, and even when you're using Chef and Puppet when I was doing it last year, is that for a big part of it you have to go out into an exec block and basically run a PowerShell script, which is just like go out and run a bash script. And I know that the support has been improving over time, but I'm not sure if it's at the point where you don't have to do that anymore. Maybe these new tools are going to provide that, where you don't have to keep executing out to PowerShell.
Yeah, I think at least in the previews Microsoft has out of some of these new versions of the tools, that it's definitely getting there, but I don't think it's generally available yet.
You talked about testing your Chef and Puppet scripts. What do you test? Do you really fire up a server, run the Puppet script, and test what is working, or?
Yeah, so there's, just like developing an application, you usually want a couple of different types of tests. And so you can do unit testing, where you're just sort of mocking things and you don't have to fire up real servers. So the advantage is it runs really fast. Although I think most of the issues we're doing with this stuff, that sort of testing won't tend to catch, because it's all integration stuff. Like if you say install IIS and you just mock the fact that IIS installs successfully, but then when you go to actually run it, you find that you don't have working network connectivity on the server yet, and it can't pull down packages that it needs in order to do things. So unless I'm extending Chef itself, adding new types of resources, I would use unit testing there, but the majority of what I'm doing is integration testing, where I'll spin up a real server, either as a VM using VirtualBox or Hyper-V, or on the cloud using Azure or Rackspace or something, and actually run all of my Chef there. And then you can use something like Server Spec to verify the results. So with Server Spec, for example, you said install IIS on port 80. You can actually write a generic test that says there should be an HTTP server on port 80. And the way Server Spec's written, it doesn't even care if it's Linux or Windows or IIS or Nginx. You're just writing the general requirement. I need to be serving a web page on port 80. So the tools that I use for testing, I think that in terms of making continuous delivery really start happening on Windows, the most important tools for me to see them start to support Windows are the tools that give developers or operations people a sandbox where they can start playing around with different things like Chef or desired state configuration or whatever. One of the great things that's happened recently is that Vagrant, Sean Neal, the guy who did Vagrant Windows, which was originally a plugin, he worked with the Vagrant core team and with Microsoft, and they actually added Hyper-V support into Vagrant, and they put a lot of effort into Windows stuff. Unfortunately, Hyper-V only runs on Windows, so that helps people already on Windows run extra Windows VMs. I'm still sort of struggling to get some of my own VirtualBox images, but VirtualBox and Vagrant on Windows does seem to be working as well. But it's not quite ready for Windows Cloud stuff yet because they added the WinRM support, but it's not secure in Vagrant yet. So if you're just talking to a local VM, that's okay. If you're talking over the internet to the cloud, you probably want some real encryption. And similarly, Test Kitchen, I think, is another project that will let people experiment and start testing. If you want to try something in desired state configuration, and then you want to try moving over to Chef and make sure it has the same result. Or if you want to test multiple versions of Windows, so maybe Server 2012 and Server Core 2012, Test Kitchen will let you do that stuff. But unfortunately, they don't quite have Windows support there yet.
Maybe because it was very plastic in the one talk you gave, Rachel, can you contrast the two concepts of a Snowflake server and a Phoenix server, and what this actually means in Windows? And I'm not sure if a Phoenix server on Windows is even possible.
Well, I mean, a Snowflake server is that, Snowflake, the idea, the analogy is that snowflakes are unique individual things, and no two are the same. And servers, I think, not just on Windows, in general, used to be like that, right? People would go off and write scripts and make changes, or they'd go through those big run books, and they're constantly just adding change to how the server is configured and what's on there. And over time, you don't change it or do anything to it because you don't know if that thing that's on it is actually useful, or do we need it? I don't know. No one wants to touch it. We don't want to break production.
Yeah. You said that Outlook became the configuration management system, kind of.
Oh yeah, you mean the emails? yeah. Well, back in the day, yeah. I mean, actually, I'm on a client right now where they're still in that old way of releasing where it's email driven, so they have the runbook and everything, but then I see on release day, I see 20 emails going back and forth. I've done step 4 to 7, now you can do step 8 and 9. And so people are still doing that out there in the industry for sure. The idea of the Phoenix server is something, that you can destroy and then pull back up whenever. And I think, is it Amazon that has the Chaos Monkey?
Netflix.
Oh, Netflix, yeah. Who one of those guys, but yeah, Netflix has the Chaos Monkey where they go around and just burn servers, and they should be able to spin them back up whenever, because everything in terms of the configuration management and the desired state is in source control, so you can just spin that back up. So that's the difference. Can we do it yet on Windows? I think you can automate most of the stuff on Windows now, but you are going to be doing a lot of PowerShell to a certain extent to call out to WinRM. One of the bigger problems is actually all the other software that you often have to put on systems that don't have any kind of unified package management or way of automating the deployment. Like some of the tools that you have to put on Windows machines, it's often literally it's a click through to get it installed, and that's hard to automate. So to a certain extent, depending on what you need to have on your server, you could have Phoenix servers, but if you've got all these weird and wonderful tools and things that you have to have on your machine that don't have a great way of being automatable, if that's a word, then it's going to be very difficult. And that's one of the challenges in Windows, is all those extra stuff that you have to put on.
I think it's definitely possible on Windows, because with Phoenix servers, even if you have things you can't automate and you're doing manual steps, it's about having images as artifacts. And so as long as at the end of the day, if you can create an image and then you're just sort of stamping servers from that, so you say, whether I need 5 servers or 20 servers in production, I just do it from this image. If server 12 is giving me problems, then I don't try to fix it. I just destroy it and I create a new one because it's easier. And I think generally the support for that imaging stuff is there. You can definitely do custom images on all of the cloud providers for Windows stuff. And with Azure, you can even export VMs running in Hyper-V and move them onto the cloud. Another important project, though, there's Packer, which is made by the same people as Vagrant, and it's sort of the counterpart in that Vagrant is for creating development environments and Packer is for creating server images for whatever platforms. And
I know that we have recorded, or we are about to record a show with the guy who did Vagrant, so maybe you can check that out. I'm not sure if it comes out after or before that, but we have more on Vagrant.
Okay, cool. But there's a Packer Windows project right now that you can use to create base VMs for everything in Windows, and you could use essentially the same technology to create customized ones for applications. One of the issues there right now, though, is that Packer doesn't have WinRM support yet. So in order to really use Packer Windows right now, what they do is they install SSH onto their Windows servers, and then they still use PowerShell, but they do all this PowerShell over SSH instead of WinRM.
Wow. But you're talking about a great, it's another pattern, the images. I didn't actually think about that. As in like an image as an artifact. So that's something that you can also like check in and you can take through your delivery pipeline. This is the image that this is going with as well.
Yeah, for me, one of the big gaps that I'm curious if we're ever going to see a Windows equivalent anytime soon is Docker. Because if you take a image of...
What is Docker?
Docker is similar to images, but it's more layered, the way I understand it. And so you just have a small core server, and then Docker drops in, like, you can have sort of a shared image that has all of your common stuff, and then you can have, like, an application layer on top of that for your application-specific stuff. But I think the big advantages with Docker is that they're much smaller because of them doing these layered images and shared images. So if you're trying to version images and you're deploying 10 times a day, and each deployment, like every time I've created a Windows image, it's been 4 gigs. So storing and transferring 4 gigs over the network every time I want to do new releases or pull down, especially for developer machines, if I want to pull down the latest image.
Yeah, it's definitely more than a couple of changes to a Puppet script.
Yeah.
You have mentioned a lot about PowerShell. I haven't done a lot of PowerShell work, and I guess most of our listeners haven't either. So can you tell us about PowerShell and contrast it maybe a little bit against Bash or a general purpose language?
So I can't really contrast it against Bash because I'm not a Linux person. But I mean, PowerShell was, well, when it first came out, was just amazing because we never really had that ability on Windows before to be able to do the level of automation that we have with PowerShell. And I actually said last year that it was like an ugly language, and I got a lot of backlash from that because people are like, actually, you can make PowerShell really nice. You can make it really you can actually do nice things with. You can make PowerShell, behave well. And I think it's one of those languages that's like that, where you can do horrible, ugly things with it, but you can actually make it behave well.
I know I haven't actually written that much PowerShell. I've just been using all of the PowerShell-based tools. But one thing I do know that's very interesting compared to Bash is they both have all of this support for pipelining, where you can take the output of one program and use it as the input for the next one and chain things together to make a more complete solution. But the difference is in Bash and on all of the Linux shells, you're piping text from one program to the next. And on PowerShell, it actually does it with objects. And so for some things, like if you've got a table and you want to get certain rows, you don't even think about it when you come from the Bash Linux background. But now that I think about that more with PowerShell, I'm like, I see a lot of Bash commands that are really hacky and that don't have any intent at all. So if you see like cut -F1 -D comma or whatever, it's because they're sort of trying to get rows of comma-separated values out of the output of one program, where with PowerShell you can just say, give me this row or this column of values, or treat it more as random access objects.
And what kind of programs or scripts you write in PowerShell? So is it all about automating existing programs like you would do in a Linux environment, or do you really write long scripts in it?
You could. It's really about automating the environment. I mean, I don't know if you're asking if you would use it for another purpose, which I don't think you would, because there are a lot of nicer languages out there for just general purpose programming. The power of PowerShell is the things that it lets you do, and the way that you can talk to like Windows remoting, and the power of it is its power, right? Is the ability to be able to automate the environments and be able to talk to different parts of Windows. So I mean, some people love it for the reason that there wasn't that there before, and so it's amazing. But then when you look at in contrast to what you can do in Linux environments with the tools that you have there, like Chef, that's a new one, Chef and Bubit, Ansible, and all these things, you're like, oh, it's actually not as great as those, because you can't have that desired state. You're still essentially scripting.
But the desired state configuration, that is pure PowerShell, the stuff they're previewing.
I thought it was, oh, okay, that's my bad. I thought it was Chef and Puppet did the desired state. They're like, it's supposed to be in this state.
Microsoft is providing a desired state configuration API that's written in PowerShell. Puppet and Chef can use that as a provider,
right,
so that
right.
They're integrating through PowerShell, or at least through the same API, so you still write the declarative desired state in Puppet or Chef, and it maps it to the PowerShell version of that, which is essentially equivalent. So if you tell Chef, I want Windows Feature IIS installed, rather than it saying, okay, in order to do that, I need to get this installer or whatever, it just tells Windows, I want this Windows feature enabled.
Right. They're still using PowerShell under the hood, basically, is what you're saying. You think?
Yeah, they will be.
Yeah.
The stuff still.
Because I think that's the thing. PowerShell gives you that ability that all the other tools have to use. But it isn't where they are in the Linux world, as far as I understand.
So as I understand it, you could say PowerShell is a programming language to facilitate communication between other tools on Windows.
Well, I think one interesting thing with PowerShell, and when I was talking about the revolutionary changes versus incremental, so Rachel wrote in one of her articles that we need to tell people we need better tools and automation on Windows, and that doesn't mean a GUI for everything. We can't have all of these GUI-driven installers. And so I thought, the cultural change is just getting all of the admins and users used to the fact that we need to have, something like OneGet, essentially, where you can just install something quickly from the command line. But what Microsoft has been doing is they still write all of the GUI stuff for Windows Server Management and all of those things, but they've said the GUI is built on top of the same PowerShell API now. And so they're saying anything you can do through the GUI, because it's being driven by PowerShell, you can do anything, the exact same stuff, without using the GUI. And hopefully, I know definitely Microsoft with their own products have been doing that. I'm hoping everybody adopts that and Windows becomes very scriptable.
It's neat for everyone to follow suit, because I mean the blockers that I've seen really is when there's some third-party tool or something that has to be installed with it, and there's no way to automate that. When the vendor created it, they weren't thinking about this in terms of how we're going to automate deployment. It's like, no, we've given you a tool and here's the instructions for how to install it, because back in the day people used to do it manually, and that's fine. And it's the cultural change, which it's great to see Microsoft sort of paving the way, because I think if they don't pave the way, the bigger vendors won't follow them. Like people in the alt.NET community, we can keep writing as many tools as we want around the ecosystem, but it's hard if Microsoft doesn't adopt that change, because then the vendors won't follow suit, and that's what we need to happen.
Maybe following on top of that, when I hear you talk, you mention a lot of open source tools, but there's still always this, but it has to be approved by Microsoft. Is that how it is, or can there be really an open source tool without Microsoft?
Though there are open source tools without Microsoft that people use. I think it's the tricky thing is a lot of Microsoft tools are used in the enterprise, and they're often much slower to adopt change, and they want things like, licensing agreements and who's going to look after it if it breaks and all this kind of stuff. And whereas open source tools are literally, people build something that they need and they share it, and other people are like, yeah, I use this too, it's cool, and the support comes from the community. And then I was in an architecture working group last week trying to get an actual even vendor tool agreed by the client, and all they want to know is like who's going to support it if it goes wrong. And so yeah, as a developer, I'm just gonna, if something's wrong or I don't understand how to do something, I'm just going to Google it and look on Stack Overflow and talk to the community, or I'm going to email people that work in that community and be like, I have this problem, can you help me? And the enterprise doesn't work like that. They want all this extra vendor support, and so it's actually harder to get those open source tools adopted in bigger enterprise. I think outside of that, if you're outside of the enterprise and you have more freedom, people are definitely using these tools. People were using NuGet and when Microsoft adopted it, and also Chocolatey. Like, it sounds like they're also going to adopt that. That's also from an open source tool. Microsoft didn't create it, but if people are starting to use it in the community, it's great if they take it on board or adopt it or support it, because it means that then we can start using these tools in the enterprise, which is what we want.
But it still sounds to me like when you as an open source tool get like supported by Microsoft, that's the way when you get the big usages.
I think that is just the nature of the beast of working in enterprise environments. I think there's a much bigger cultural change there that needs to happen in terms of how people think about software development and how you get support. And so many enterprise organizations are used to, it's a tool, if it breaks, I'm going to get support for it. And the way that software development has evolved is different to that. It's more about, here's the tool that solves this problem really well, and there's an entire community of millions of developers out there who are also probably using this tool who can help me if I have a problem. And it's a mindset change as well.
One of the things I really like about open source tools that I think people should keep in mind when they're making their purchase decisions is the support from the community is such a huge thing, and I think the most visible thing is some of the tools with really large user conferences. So you look at Chef Conf and Puppet Conf, and with these tools, if you want to know the best practices and how other people are doing it and those things, you don't even have to go to those events. All of those videos are available on YouTube, and you can go and watch the actual users explaining what they're doing, where they had problems, how to use it. With a lot of the commercial tools, because it's not always that open, the only people a lot of times that you can get to tell you the right way to do it or give you a demo and show you how the project works is the vendor, the people actually trying to sell it to you.
Which totally ties you in. I mean, I can't remember. I mean, I Google things every day, all the time in my job, and I can't remember the last time I Googled something and there wasn't an answer, or like 10 answers. Or on Stack Overflow, you just go to the one that got upvoted the most, right? There's always a way to solve the problem. When I first started developing, like 14 years ago, whenever it was, Google wasn't like it was now. I don't even think Google was around. I think we were using Yahoo at the time. But, if you had a problem, it took ages to find it. And in the Windows world, it was all like MSDN and the licenses, and you had to go and search through all of their stuff and, had to find the one way to do it. Now, you Google something, there's like a million ways to do it. You'll find a video or someone's done it. And especially with these big tools that like everyone is consuming. And so it's actually, it's hard to convince the architects and people in the enterprise that that's actually better than just being locked down by a vendor. It's a black box. You don't know how it works. You've got a problem. You log it. Maybe they'll fix it if it's a priority, or it's back and forth. Whereas, let me just Google that and I could probably fix this today, right? So,
do you have some good ways to make the argument you just said is necessary? So what should I tell my boss if he wants to buy a big tool which is very expensive and needs a GUI installer?
So the way that I approach that is looking at using examples where I know that other people have used an open source tool versus a big tool. I mean, something like a service bus, enterprise service bus is a great example of that. There's a lot of these big vendors selling big enterprise service buses, whereas there's tons of tools out there that can do, messaging just as easily that aren't so expensive, and the support is in the community. You can also put, for the business side, winning that argument can be a case of some things like I look at, when was the last check-in on that tool, right? So is it actually actively being worked on? Because that tells you that people are making changes to it and fixing it right now, and that's great. How many contributors has it got? How many people are using it? You can find out this information, get some idea of like how well used it is and how big the community is, and you can sort of put those figures together and give, help them make a better decision in terms of choose this open source tool, which if it breaks, we can fix it. Because that's always the question that we get. It's like, what if it breaks? Who's going to fix it? It's like, we can fix it. It's an open source tool. We can check it out and make the changes ourselves, and then we can do a pull request, and maybe it'll fix it for everyone else, But it's a total different mindset change, and there is a lot of convincing that we have to do in that way, and then like culturally getting them out of that vendor support mindset as well.
Yeah, I think when I've seen people doing purchase decisions, they usually have different categories they're looking at. They'll have a checklist or matrix or whatever to fill out. And so there'll always be like price, licensing, and a big focus on features. And I think we just need to remind people that culture should be at least as emphasized as the feature set, probably. And it's definitely important to look at, how active are the projects, how many other companies are using it, what are their user conferences and things like. And for the gap in features, you're really looking for either a vendor or a community that you can partner with, not just something that necessarily solves your current needs, but one that's going to be able to handle your needs 2 years from now. And so if you look at, okay, if there's a gap in the features, how long will it take the vendor for you to convince them that it's needed and they should put some effort into it, and then for them to finally deliver it, versus the open source community? And if you have the skills, if you say like, oh, this one feature is a deal breaker, we need it, then you could say, well, how much effort would it actually take us to implement the features we need, and then give it back to the community?
And I think there's a thing, one of the issues that I face is when they're talking about, what's going to happen in a few years, is we've no idea what the state of the ecosystem is going to be in a few years. And so many organizations, large organizations, they're only just moving off XP, right? And it's like you need to constantly be thinking about upgrading, and the culture of improvement and upgrade needs to happen within the teams. And when you start to create that culture, then you can start answering questions like, well, can't we build that in? Like, let us fix it. Let us add it to it, rather than we're just going to hand that off to somebody else and we're just going to keep pumping out code. It's like we need to start thinking about how does our system work in production? We're going to need to be making continuous changes and get out of the mindset of, okay, I've got, a 2-year plan. This is my project. It's going to get delivered in 2 years and it's never going to change. Like that is a complete fallacy. We know that the software is going to keep changing. And so that needs to be part of the culture of like, we know it's going to change. We want to be able to make changes. The vendor might not be able to move as fast as us, but we can move that fast because we need that feature. We're going to build it, or we're going to find another open source tool that can do that feature for us.
This brings me to maybe a little bit provocative final question: is why don't you guys just use Linux?
It's because we don't always have the choice. So there are tools out there that only run on Windows. For example, the client I'm on right now has built a specific tool that only runs on Windows. It's been running for 10 years. We're not going to turn around and say, that tool that you've been building for like 10 years. So Windows sucks. So why don't you just rebuild the whole thing so that we can put it onto a Linux environment? It's more about you don't always have the choice. In a lot of cases you need to be on Windows. So let's make it better rather than just being like, oh, this doesn't work and throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? It's like, oh, Windows sucks, so I'm not going to do anything on it anymore. We're going to rewrite all the applications that need to live on Windows. So I've been in Windows for 10 years and it's not going anywhere. So we have to fix some of the issues that are in there.
Yeah, for me, I think if you actually have a choice between being on Windows or being on Linux, then I would usually choose Linux. But I think even for new applications, it's not just always the legacy stuff. It's about who are the users going to be, who are the developers available, who are the operations people. So if you've been a .NET organization for a long time and you're writing tools for an organization that uses Windows desktops, then it doesn't necessarily make sense to retrain everyone, even for when there's no legacy and you get to start something new.
Yeah. It's about constraints, right? So you've got these constraints, you have to do it. So we have to make it better. And it sounds like, I'm really happy even in the last 2 years, what's happening in the community, the community tools that are being built, the progress that Microsoft is making as well in adopting and actually running with them and supporting things like Chocolatey or taking it on board and using it in their tools this is all promising. It's going to get better.
All right. So I will want to now give you the opportunity to ask or to ask for the question I should have asked and then answer it.
I got a question for you before that.
Okay.
Have you used Pester? Do you know anything about Pester?
Yeah, I've used it. Not in massive anger. When I realized that I was like, so there must be a TDD tool for like unit testing. I mean, for PowerShell. And then a thought worker was like, yeah, I wrote one. So yeah, I've used it a little bit. It's cool. It gives you the ability to do unit testing in PowerShell, which is nice because I think for me, one of the great things about unit testing is it changes, at least if you do TDD, it changes the way that you think about how you develop your code. And I think having a tool like that changes the way that people write the PowerShell script. So rather than just bashing out like, right, I'm just going to write this line to make this work, and then I'm going to write this to make this work, it's like you actually being more thinking more clearly about, okay, what do I need it to do, and then writing a test for that. And so I think it's more about behavior. I mean, it's great to have unit testing, but I think it's bringing out better behavior, because one of the things that I've seen coming to systems where people are like, yeah, we've got PowerShell scripts, and you go in there and they're massive and they're really hard to read, and then, it doesn't have well-named variables or anything in there, and it's all that stuff. I'm like, oh, didn't we solve these problems in just coding years ago? Why have we gone into a new language and just forgotten everything we knew about, encapsulation and how we break things up and how we make things understandable and readable, and that would be, I mean, it seems like for the foreseeable future, PowerShell is here to stay. And so let's at least write it nicely. Did you have another question? I'm trying to think of any questions.
Or just some last words you would like to say.
For me, I talked about it a little earlier, but the question I would have asked myself was, what are the most important DevOps projects going on for Windows right now? And for me, it's really, like I said, all about being able to have sandboxes where developers and ops guys can play around with things, they can collaborate. So for me, the most important projects are getting complete support for Windows and Vagrant. Microsoft has one big barrier to Vagrant, even though it's mostly functionally complete, is trying to get the images for Windows. So Microsoft has released a couple of different images, but it's like the images they released in the form of a Vagrant box is only for Hyper-V, so you can only use it on Windows. And then they have other images that are just like regular VM images, so you have to build your own Vagrant boxes out of them using Packer or doing it manually. So when I wanted to create a VM that I could use to test on Windows, it takes me a couple of hours just to create it. And then the problem is, once I've done that, you would hope I would save everyone else the time, but because no one's, I guess, either restricted or just everyone's unsure of how the licensing works for Windows, nobody shares these. So everybody has to waste the same half a day to build their own VM images. But yeah, Vagrant's a very important project. And then, like I said, Test Kitchen, because if you're doing multiple different versions of Windows or Windows and Linux, Test Kitchen lets you validate a whole set of servers, different roles. If you've got a application where you've got like infrastructure automation for web nodes versus database nodes, you can use Test Kitchen for that.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that. I think one of the biggest blockers to doing continuous delivery on Windows is the ability to spin up machines and start making changes and testing locally as quickly as possible, because that's what you want. You want that fast feedback, and that's the really, as soon as we start talking about that in Windows environments, it's like there's like a big sigh that happens inside me, because I'm like, I know, here we're going to go down this fun journey again, and we're going to. But even if we could get the right image and spin everything up, it's like there's licensing issues with, you've got all these vendor tools, and they've got one in production and one in QA, and you're like, but I need to be able to test it all the time whenever I want. It's like,
yeah.
I think there's that, and then I think getting the vendors to follow suit would be a great win as well. I actually think just in general the way that the old school like vendor relationships and the way that they currently operate, that kind of black box I feel like that just needs to change as a whole, and we need to start encouraging this API driven way of doing things, and to have tools that interoperate well with other tools, and tools that do one thing well, and stop this like crazy, let's buy this great big tool that you can only deploy once and it takes a GUI to do it, and all these kinds of things. So yeah, that would be nice.
All right. So where can people find out more about Windows continuous delivery and automation? You've written a couple of blogs, I heard.
Yes, the couple of blogs I wrote on ThoughtWorks.com from last year. And actually the interesting thing was some of the comments in the bottom linked to a ton more articles that people have written. And there's a lot of people there doing good stuff. I don't know if you can talk to where people can find out the stuff around WoodGet and what you were talking about, the stuff that Microsoft are up to.
Yeah, we can provide links for that.
Yeah, be good. All right. What's the best way to get in touch with you? Twitter? Email?
Tweet
Do you have
tweet
a blog?
me. Yeah, you can tweet me. It's at Rachel Laycock.
I'm working on a ton of open source stuff right now, so if you want to see more of what I'm up to, GitHub's actually a great way to find me, and there's an email address on there.
All right. Then I thank you very much for being on the show. I will provide you with all the links and all the stuff we mentioned in the show notes, so you don't have to type from listening. We would actually, as SE Radio, like to get feedback from you. So maybe write a comment or a review in iTunes and tell us what you like the most and the least in this episode or something like that. In these terms, we are saying goodbye. This is Johannes from SE Radio. Thanks for the show.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more information about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To support us, you can advertise SE Radio by clicking the Dig, Reddit, Delicious, or /dot buttons on the site, or by talking about us on Facebook, Twitter, or your own blog. If you have feedback specific to an episode, please use the commenting feature on the site so that other listeners can respond to your comments as well. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under the Creative Commons 2.5 license. Please see the website for details. Thanks again for your support.